Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good night, depending on wherever you are. Welcome to this session on storing and using large data in SharePoint. My name is Jackson, and I'm a principal consultant working for Mindtree Limited. I'm based out of Bangalore. I've been working in the SharePoint space for quite a while, since the 2003 version onwards. And I've seen quite a lot of SharePoint deployments across customers from various domains and different users of SharePoint all across. So in this session, I will be primarily focusing on some of the best practices and common mistakes that people make that I've seen while implementing SharePoint. During this, I will not perhaps talk about some of the information that is there or walk through the information that's there in the MSDN documentation, but my primary aim of this is to just point out to you the things to consider when you actually have a large SharePoint implementation in mind. So just a brief disclaimer. Most of the information over here is more or less common sense or should be natural to people who actually are doing work on SharePoint. However, why I feel it makes sense in presenting it today is that a lot of common things are usually missed out on, and obvious things are usually missed out on, and leading to issues with SharePoint implementations. So with that, let's get started. The first aspect when we talk about SharePoint and we are planning a SharePoint implementation that everyone should be aware of are the limits in SharePoint, the boundaries. What can SharePoint be driven to do? So for this, there are three basic terminologies used: boundaries, thresholds, and supported limits. Boundaries are essentially hard limits. Those are things that you can't just get over. They are well defined and non-negotiable, so those are pretty easy to look at. You know that you definitely can't go below them, beyond them. Examples are those are the 2 GB upload limit that is imposed by SharePoint. Thresholds are kind of configurable limits which are restricted. There are certain thresholds set to them. There's a limit set that can be configured, so you can extend them. However, you have to keep in mind that those values have been set for a particular reason. So if you plan on extending them, then you should do adequate testing, etc. So and then you can actually extend it till you actually reach the boundaries. So some of those limits are the 500 item threshold view of a list, the 50 MB upload limits, etc. Supported limits are the range to which applications have been tested, after which there's no real guarantee on how the application will behave. If you plan on crossing these, you're kind of on uncharted territory. You'll have to carry out much of due diligence and tests while designing your applications and proceeding with the development. So these are the three main terminologies, and there is a excellent article in TechNet that actually highlights all the boundaries, limits, etc. So I would say the first step you would need to do in actually designing an application is actually to understand all those limits over there that's provided in the documentation, and it gets to multiple levels, so you can actually see the limits for different various objects that you will be using in SharePoint: users, groups, sites, lists, libraries, etc. You will have to do the necessary calculation, so your farm, your SharePoint's implementation is at a particular level right now, and talk to the business stakeholders and kind of figure out. You should actually figure out how much it will grow in the next, at least 5 years. and based on that try to match it to the boundary limits specified over here. If you feel as a best practice, what I've tried to enforce is if you feel that there is a chance of the limits getting kind of, or the values actually getting close to the boundaries and thresholds, perhaps even a possibility, highlight all of those, document all of those, and then work out a strategy so that if those limits actually, if you actually hit those limits, people actually know what to do before just rolling out their project. Now, assuming we know all these boundaries, thresholds, and limits, now that is not the only thing that should be considered. So it's not just enough to know that my list can support 30 million items. So just because that is the supported limit that is specified by Microsoft, so just because there is a 30 million limit, and so if I have 20 million items, so does that mean I can just dump it all in a SharePoint list? So no. Well, it's not just seeing how much that you can actually use a list for, or how much you can actually populate a particular object in SharePoint, but also there has to be considerations on what you plan to do with it, because that is important to in determining a lot of parameters in terms of performance, maintainability, etc. So get the functionality right. Understand what the data is going to be used for, and once you know that, so let's see, once you get that information, what do you do next? Now, to answer that question, let's go back to some of the fundamentals of SharePoint. So what we have, SharePoint, it basically consists of lists. So lists is a sort of a core of SharePoint, as you all know, and is a foundation for all the other storage implementations such as document libraries, pages library, etc. It's all kind of built up on this foundation of this list. Now, if you look at the characteristics of list, or what a list is meant to do, so it's meant for collaboration. It's flexible. Flexible in the sense that you can add on additional columns, or change columns at will. There's the whole UI for that. You can do it for a list. It's open. By open, I mean it's not something that is locked down or closed, and to gain access to it, you'll have to do something special to expose the data in it. If there is a list available by default, it just inherits whatever permission is there in the site. It's customizable. You can add on custom properties and custom columns and use your custom code to add on things to it. All the CRUD operations are available. So you have all your add, edit, view screens, and all the information in it is versionable. So that's all that SharePoint, that list has. Now, what is it not? So a list is not a replacement for a DB table. So this is, a common point of discussion when I see people actually trying to implement SharePoint projects. Where do I put my data? Do I put in a database, or do I put in a SharePoint list? My approach to that is not to consider, what I'm going to, how I'm going to use, or what functionality SharePoint allows me on the data, but rather to see what the data is going to be, what is the nature of the data. Is it just something that I need for collaboration, for just as a lightweight repository, or is it actually going to be used for some core system, for a core functionality in my enterprise? So that should be the point of discussion, to understand what the data is going to be used for, what is the nature of the data, and based on that basically decide what to do with the list. I think a lot of these discussions came up, especially after the, when people moved over from SharePoint 2007 to 2010. SharePoint 2010 had a lot of these features that kind of made SharePoint lists look relational, although they are not relational. It allowed lookups, pulling up additional values from lookups, allowing cascading deletes, etc. So a lot of those issues that people usually got blocked with when they tried to implement lists in 2007 were removed in 2010. But then it also gave a cause for a lot of people to misinterpret the actual reuse of a list and treat it as a database. So when we get into such sort of situations, just one point I would like to highlight is we can actually think on trying to make use of both the worlds. So SharePoint list provides a UI, whereas a database provides good RDB, thus good data storage mechanism. So we could try to use, and this is something that you could look at, is basically trying to make use of both the features out of a list and also the properties of a database, making use of external content types and exposing data from database into SharePoint using BCS. However, once you do that, you should think on some of the restrictions that this actually imposes on the list. So you can't have workflows on it, etc. You can have lookups to it, etc. So those are some things that you could. This is something that you could consider given the limitations. Where I've seen a lot of people successfully use this kind of model is for master data management, when they have certain masters available in the database. SharePoint just gives that, since it gives a CRUD screen, there isn't any development required for someone to actually create all those screens all over again in .NET or whatever. So that is a useful scenario that you could look at. So now we talked about lists and some of the characteristics of the list. I just want to point out, I'll give a scenario, a very common scenario of how doing things the wrong way can actually lead into pretty serious issues, and things get just ugly at the end of it. So let's jump to a requirement. So here we have a very simple requirement for an issue tracking system. So if we start dwelling into the requirements, so the basic thing is assign an issue and update an issue. So someone gets an issue, assign it to another person. The assignee actually gets notified of that issue, and once he resolves it, updates it back. So sort of an implementation of the task list, which is fine. This looks like totally doable in SharePoint. Another requirement that could come up is one person should not be able to update another user's tasks, which is also fine. And once people start using such a system, if it's implemented, we will see that there is more and more, and we see there is more and more popularity of this. There will be multiple departments wanting to use the same system. So we'll get into a scenario where we might have to consider having a task list with folders for different departments, or perhaps different task lists altogether, which is totally fine, and based on the department, give appropriate permission level. One department should not view another department's task, which is fine. As I said, assigning different levels of permissions to different task lists or the folders as per the design we may plan to follow. Now, once we do that, another thing that could come up is people may not be too satisfied with the views and with the screens that have been provided by SharePoint. So they may want something that looks pretty fancy. So they saw some cool application somewhere and they want to replicate that over here, the UI for that over here, update multiple issues in one shot, or assign multiple issues, in one shot. So there are ways that you can do it in SharePoint, but some people might just get a bit, too picky about the sort of user interface that they would need for each one of these operations. So this is the time when can be done, totally, definitely can be done with a bit of customization. But now, so we've kind of reached a level where now we are kind of shaky on the actual usage of the SharePoint list, since a big functionality of it is gone altogether. Another requirement that could come up is certain issues for a department are marked as sensitive. So only users related to that issue should be able to view it. So now we are talking about perhaps going into some level of item level permissions, ensuring that users can't view the information unless they are actually related to it somehow. And once, a typical thing is once there's a lot of data, there's a lot of information in SharePoint or any repository, reports will be something that will come up as a most definite requirement. So simple reports, perhaps of all open issues, etc., fine, but things like issues open for the last so many days, trending of the closure, finding the performance of how fast people have closed it, seeing how many users are closing issues at what sort of rates, etc. So these are sort of things that could that would definitely crop up once you have a lot of data in. So although the example I've given here is for a issue tracking system, for a lot of you'll find a lot of similarity to these sort of requirements when you start considering using SharePoint to as a repository to add a lot of data. So let's take some of these aspects. So one is, as I was mentioning, about the removing of the views or people wanting to customize how they actually interact with the add, edit, delete screens of SharePoint. So one thing that what I pointed out earlier is the fact that SharePoint has all those CRUD operations in it, and it's very flexible. So now, if we try to implement custom screens for all those add, edit, delete, etc., you're actually limiting now the flexibility of the SharePoint list. Now, what that means is if you actually want now to add another column or make some changes in the list schema, you can't do it. So you can actually kind of tie it down like a, you're actually now treating like a table. You tie it down saying that these are fields in the list, and this is my screen that I'm going to expose out, and these are the number of fields that I'm going to display. So if you add another field, it doesn't actually automatically pop up unless you write your appropriate code to do that, which could get a bit complex. Basically, a re-implementation of what is there in SharePoint. So once you get to this stage, so this is the first sort of a warning bell that you should think when implementing list for storing data. If people say that they want total custom screens, then it should kind of trigger you to think on the actual storage mechanism. The next aspect is certain issues marked as sensitive. So there are various ways of doing this that I've seen. And one thing that you definitely should note is do not try to hide list items making use of the UI elements. So just because a user cannot get to an item by default does not mean that the item is totally locked away from them. And we should not assume that all the users are people who don't understand don't understand how to write code or how to write call web services, etc. Especially in this case where we mentioned that these are sensitive information, so which would imply that some people might try to gain access to them. Just using UI mechanism is definitely not the way to do it. If a person has access to a particular list item, it is always a security option, regardless of what all other masking mechanisms are tried. So then that brings to the other aspect of it. So we might say, now let's just break the permission for that particular item. Now, which is fine. However, there is this document on fine-grained permissions in SharePoint, which is something that the documentation there is very useful. It is not there in 2007 time period. It came with the 2010 release, but it applies to both versions. It explains about the issues that you would have if you're going with fine-grained permissions for a large number of users. So to ensure that your implementation is not going to be a nightmare from a performance or a maintenance perspective, you should read that document before implementing any sort of fine-grained permissions, which is essentially breaking list level permissions, document level permissions within a SharePoint. Then the other thing, which is a point of concern over here, is the report of basically reporting. So you could actually connect SharePoint lists to performance point and SSRS, etc., to get your charts, graphs, etc., for the reports. However, SharePoint list is not so read optimized as a database. So those sort of reports are things that people just want in a ad hoc, in a once in a while fashion, where it is okay for the report to get generated, where the server usage is very low, so you can actually loop through or write your queries to get the information out of SharePoint. Perhaps this is a okay solution, but if there is need for actually more real-time data and ad hoc queries, etc., then this is something that should really be considered. When we work with large lists, some of the considerations that you should be having. One is try to respect the default thresholds as much as possible. This includes the lookups, number of lookups, the number of lists per view, etc. Try not to modify them as far as possible. So as I mentioned, the threshold doesn't mean that these cannot be modified, but those thresholds have been kept there for a particular purpose, which is primarily best practice for most scenarios. So if you modify them, just be aware of that you need to do additional validation on your server. Leverage content type. So if you have a list with a whole huge number of items, in some cases most of them would be related items, would be of the same type, but in quite a lot of cases it would be feasible, or you would have the ability to actually separate the content, making use of different content types. So using different content types actually helps in a couple of ways. One, it actually helps. It's a good filter in queries, and so that you can just you can write your queries against a particular content type. That's one very good filter sort of for your queries into a SharePoint list. And this from a data entry perspective, so that people only see the required fields when they try to add or edit an item, and you don't see fields which you don't require when you do that. Consider usage of indexes. Well, although not as it's not as strong or as or capable of improving the performance as database indexes. However, they are very useful when you're doing reads against certain fields. Leverage metadata navigation. So if you try the metadata navigation, you'll see that if you use a metadata field, you would know that you can actually have a hierarchy of things which you can actually tag to a list item. The metadata navigation actually gives that same sort of UI in your page, so you can actually use that hierarchy to filter items, which is a very useful feature, especially if it is a very useful feature for large lists in order to get to a particular item. Using the metadata fields is also very important in terms of search, etc. You can actually do a search on a parent item to get all items, all the child items as well that are related to it. Just doing normal tagging using lookups, you won't be able to achieve those sort of functionality. And split information, making use of folders, which is always better for navigation and performance. Now, when we talk about accessing the data, so there are all these ways that you can do it. You can use the list view, the XSLT list view. You can configure your UI that using that. You can use a content query web part. You can have your custom code where you make use of camel queries to get the information that you want out, etc. So you could do all of those. Or you could use search. So now, for all the items from the first option, one of the restricting factors is it's all based on a site collection. So the boundary of all of it is essentially a site collection. Whereas for most implementations where you would be working with large data, we will have information split across different site collections invariably. So due to various reasons, and using search, you can actually get information across all those site collections in one shot, since it's something that's running on top of all those site collections. It will be much faster since the queries are against an optimized, a read optimized object, which is the index. So performance-wise, it would be beneficial as well. The disadvantage of it, of course, is the fact that the data is not real-time. They would need a crawl in order to get the latest data in, and that crawl could be scheduled. It won't be too frequently scheduled together. So that's a disadvantage of the search. Now, I was telling about sites being split up, etc., into different site collections, which we've seen. So this is a typical question that comes up once we plan to have large data in. So should I put all my information in one site or multiple sites? So not just for having, this is not a debate that comes in only when you have lots of data. Even if you have smaller chunks of data, you will find keep again the situation where we'll actually have to define whether do I put my data in different subsites, or should I create different site collections to put my information in. My users may be different for each one of that, so which one do I choose? So this is not a really straightforward answer to this, and how I usually go about it is I make use of I have a small table which I use, and for each customer I usually apply different weightages to each one of the aspects over here. So this is a snapshot of the table. There are some of fields that I keep adding on as I go across various implementations, and based on the weightage, I can see what what actually makes more sense, and then decide on how I would want to structure the sites. And of course, all of this would have to consider all the boundaries and limitations I've talked about earlier. Now, we've talked about lists, and now let's talk about documents. So as I mentioned, documents are also a sort of a inherited version of the list. So whatever all the aspects that I've mentioned about lists holds good for documents as well. However, with documents there is another property which should be our largest most consideration, which is the size. So in addition to all those limits that are there in SharePoint, you should also consider the data storage. So in SQL or in your SAN storage, etc., because that data needs to be maintained, managed, backed up, etc. It has to have adequate DR mechanisms. You have to plan your archival policies, etc. on it. So this is something that should be considered. So although although there's a whole lot of considerations within SharePoint itself, there's also the backend part, the storage part of it that should be really reckoned with in implementation that has a lot of a huge document repository. With respect to the limits that are supported, this too is from the same MSDN document. Do read all the fine prints carefully. So the limits that is suggested supported is 200 GB per content database, which is for typical scenarios. And with the SharePoint SP1, along with the SP1, there's another update to this in which it is suggested that you can actually have more than have up to 4 terabytes of data, terabytes per content database. So which is fine. However, there are a lot of clauses with this, and Microsoft suggests that you should actually figure out all of these, actually take all of these into consideration when you're actually planning on scaling your database out to more than 200 gigabytes. One part which I would like to mention over here, since it's along with the limits, is regarding RBS. A common misconception that was there earlier was that since you're using RBS, the database size is much smaller, and the files that are kept outside of the database are not included in this limit size. However, Microsoft has clearly stated that the total volume of the content database includes the blob storage plus the metadata in the content database. So that's something to keep in mind while implementing RBS. So another point which I mentioned for carrying out effective management of your lists was not just the limits, but what you plan to do with the documents in it, or with the items in it. So yeah, if typically when people go from from a base, almost no document management system, and planning to use something like SharePoint to store the documents, there are a lot of things that should be considered besides the thresholds. It's also what people would like to do, or what the usage of those documents are. So some of the things that I've listed out here, documents that are project related, are documents that could be collaborative in nature. So multiple people would work on them. There would be people would have comments, their views, different versions needs to be maintained. There would be a check and check out mechanism, etc. required. So that's one level of documents that can be in an enterprise. Another one is legal documents, statement of works, contracts, etc., which are a lot of them are actually signed. Using actually hard copies which are signed and scanned into the system. So you could create digital versions of those, but they are not meant for editing within an electronic tool. So any edits would have to go via the physical copy and then scanned in. So those mainly are treated as read-only files. They may not be very frequently used. Other media files, so images, videos, etc. These files will typically not be used directly, but they'll be linked to by external applications. Websites, etc. may use SharePoint as a content repository for some of those. Archive files, which essentially is what the SharePoint provides for the records management template of SharePoint provides documents information that is not frequently used or rarely used for updating. It's mainly for storage ones, and then people may refer to it once in a while. Not much of updates to those. Application files, another set of files that could be there, perhaps installation files, media such as those, which could be accessed by other applications, etc. So when planning on using SharePoint as a document repository, don't just say that dump everything into SharePoint, because that may not be the optimal usage of SharePoint. However, figure each one of these out and then find what the usage of that is. So typically, SharePoint is meant for collaboration. So putting a document in place which you don't use or not too many people use or access is just bloating up what SharePoint, the bloating of the SharePoint database. So you can look at various different options. So especially with large files, the RBS is an option which can be used for better performance. You can actually even plan on keeping the files as it is on a file share. If they are not collaborative in nature, they are large in size and rarely used for any sort of editing. There are actually third-party tools that actually allow you to host or put the files outside SharePoint and then link to them. So not really via the RBS interface, but it just provides a link of files within your SharePoint context. So how that helps is, although you don't have those files in SharePoint, from a single interface you can view those files, so you don't have to go to your file share to actually access those files. And then of course you could use SharePoint search to actually index the contents of the files, so you'll get all of that. However, all the other features such as check-in, check-out, versioning, workflows, etc. are not enabled in them. So those tools are good for files that are kind of more or less static in nature. So that actually comes to the end of what I wanted to present. In summary, and this is something that people who have watched Avengers would be aware of it. Do not get into a SharePoint implementation without understanding the limits, boundaries, and thresholds that SharePoint provides. You should look at all the available documentation, read them and understand them well before jumping into a large SharePoint implementation. There is a lot of documentation that talks about various ways to access your lists, keep your list in place, libraries, etc. That is available in MSDN. And although most of them should be common knowledge, as I mentioned, to general SharePoint users, these sort of things seem to be frequently missed out while planning a lot of SharePoint implementations. So thank you, and if you have any questions, I can take them now.
Thanks, Jackson. Really appreciate that.
Thank you, Alpesh.
Yes. So, yeah. If any questions, we still probably have some time on hand. Okay. Looks like there aren't any questions coming through. So. Appreciate that you could make it, Jackson. I'll get in touch with you